the HOA presence level of fines from every car crossing the border.
Go to your neighborhood.
I knew the delay was serious when a woman with an HOA badge tried to argue bylaws with federal agents who hadn't even finished checking our IDs. We were lined up just before the checkpoint booths, engines idling, dust hanging low in the morning heat, the kind of stop where nobody talks much and everyone just waits their turn. I was riding with a small work convoy heading out of a neighborhood that sat awkwardly close to the border, close enough that this checkpoint was routine for anyone commuting out. The agents were calm and efficient, moving vehicles through at a steady clip, and everything felt normal until the woman 2 cars ahead of me opened her door before being waved forward. She had one of those laminated HOA badges clipped to her shirt like it was official government gear, and even from where I sat I could see she was keyed up. She kept craning her neck to look back at the line, then forward at the agents, like she was trying to manage both sides at once. I heard her before I clearly saw her, talking loudly about vehicles leaving out of compliance, and how she'd already made notes. The phrase didn't make sense in this setting, but she said it with confidence, like people were supposed to recognize it as authority. A couple drivers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to ignore her or engage, and that hesitation alone slowed the line. As we crept forward a few feet, she walked along the shoulder, pointing at bumpers and license plates, muttering about overnight parking limits and unauthorized decals. She wasn't yelling yet, but her voice carried enough to cut through the hum of engines. One guy rolled his window down just to tell her he was going to miss his shift if she didn't step back. She waved him off and said fines would be handled later, like that was supposed to be reassuring. The agents noticed the movement immediately, one of them glancing up from a passport to track her path, his posture tightening without turning aggressive. When she reached the front of the line, she stopped just short of the booth and started explaining to the agent that several residents were exiting without resolving HOA compliance issues. The agent didn't bite, just told her to return to her vehicle and wait for instructions. That should have ended it, but she nodded like she'd heard him while still continuing her point, insisting the HOA had an obligation to document departures. The agent paused processing the next car, which created a gap, and suddenly the whole lane felt stalled. I could feel the mood change in my own vehicle, that low-level tension when something small threatens to turn into a bigger mess. Radios crackled from the booth as another agent stepped closer, clearly there to support his partner. The woman took that as validation instead of warning, doubling down about fines and reports, saying names would be forwarded if residents tried to bypass her authority. Nobody raised their voice, but control quietly shifted away from her as the agents stopped moving cars altogether. By the time I rolled up to the booth, she was still standing off to the side, clipboard hugged tight, completely unaware that her presence alone had already triggered a procedural slowdown. The agent handed my ID back a little slower than usual, eyes flicking past me toward her, then told me to stay put for a moment. That was when I realized this wasn't just an annoying delay anymore. Something official was about to happen, and she didn't seem to realize she'd just put herself square in the middle of it. The agent raised a hand before anyone else could speak, palm out, calm but unmistakably firm, and told everyone to remain inside their vehicles until instructed otherwise. His voice wasn't loud, just practiced, the kind that carries authority without needing to flex. He pointed to the cones and the booth, explaining that checkpoint procedures came first and questions could wait. A couple of engines shut off, and the line settled into place like people finally understood the rules of the room. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the woman with the HOA badge stepped closer, clearly not planning to let it slide. She cut in mid-sentence, saying residents were still subject to HOA rules even while waiting. Her clipboard came up like a shield as she explained departure violations and documentation requirements. The timing was bad because the agent hadn't even finished his instruction, and the interruption landed hard. The agent turned fully toward her, eyes steady, posture squared, and repeated his direction for everyone to stay put. A second agent shifted position beside the booth, not aggressively, just closing space. That subtle movement told me the tone had officially changed. The agent then stated, slowly and clearly, that the checkpoint fell under federal jurisdiction. He explained that once vehicles entered the controlled area, federal rules superseded any private association policies. His words were clipped and deliberate, like he'd given this explanation before and expected it to stick. She nodded while he spoke, but her expression said she wasn't absorbing it. When he finished, she responded that the HOA controlled the roads leading up to the checkpoint and therefore retained authority over resident conduct. A few drivers groaned quietly, realizing this wasn't wrapping up anytime soon. The agent didn't argue back and didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated that all instructions would come from checkpoint personnel and that interfering with operations wasn't allowed. That sentence landed heavier than the rest, and I saw a couple of people straighten up in their seats. She tried to pivot, saying she was assisting with compliance and traffic flow. The agent shook his head once and told her to return to her vehicle immediately. That was the first direct command, and it shifted the balance in a way she didn't seem to notice. Instead of complying, she took a half step back and gestured toward the line, continuing to explain her role. The agent signaled to his partner, who stepped closer and stood slightly behind her shoulder. No hands were raised, no threats made, but the positioning alone boxed her in. The checkpoint processing stopped completely, and radios crackled as information was passed along. I could see drivers checking mirrors and phones, sensing that this delay was becoming official. The power had clearly moved away from her, even if she was still talking. The agent then addressed everyone in line, stating that the delay was due to a procedural issue and asking for patience. That announcement stripped her of the audience she'd been working so hard to command. She looked around, clearly frustrated that attention wasn't swinging her way anymore. When she tried to speak again, the agent cut her off with a short request to step aside and wait. She hesitated, eyes darting between the uniforms as if weighing her options. For the first time, her confidence wavered. I stayed in my car, watching as another agent approached from farther down the checkpoint. The original agent told him something quietly, and the newcomer nodded, already assessing the scene. The woman was still standing near the booth, clipboard lowered now, her authority reduced to background noise. The line wasn't moving and nobody knew how this would resolve yet. All I knew was that the situation had crossed into something bigger, and whatever happened next wasn't going to be handled by an HOA. She didn't go back to her car like she was told. Instead, she opened the door wider and stepped fully into the lane, planting herself between vehicles like she owned the asphalt. I saw her point sharply at the sedan ahead of her and motion for the driver to pull back, telling him he couldn't proceed until his HOA paperwork was reviewed. The guy looked stunned, hands frozen on the wheel, glancing between her and the booth like he was waiting for someone else to correct the situation. That moment alone jammed the line tighter than before. She leaned toward his window, clipboard up again, explaining that departures had to be logged and approved, especially during non-standard exits. Her tone was brisk, rehearsed, like she'd said it 100 times at board meetings. The driver cracked his window just enough to say the agents already cleared him. She shook her head and replied that clearance didn't override HOA documentation. That sentence landed badly, because one of the agents had already stepped away from the booth and was watching her closely, radio clipped to his vest. Processing stopped completely. No IDs were being scanned, no cars waved through. The agent at the booth raised his head and called out for her to return to her vehicle immediately. She didn't turn around. Instead, she lifted her voice and said she was preventing unauthorized crossings, like she was doing everyone a favor. Another agent walked out from behind the barrier, positioning himself between her and the booth, his presence calm but unmistakable. The power dynamic shifted right there, even if she refused to acknowledge it. She pivoted toward him and started explaining that HOA agreements predated the checkpoint, that residents had obligations before leaving the community. He listened without interrupting, then told her she was interfering with a federal operation and needed to step back now. No emotion, no debate. She tried to counter by saying she was only asking for a brief pause. The agent shook his head and repeated the order, this time slower, like he was documenting it in his head as he spoke. The driver she'd stopped finally put his car in park, unsure what else to do. That hesitation rippled backward through the line, engines shutting off one by one. I could feel irritation building, not explosive, just heavy and uncomfortable. The agents exchanged quick glances, and one of them spoke quietly into his radio, eyes never leaving her. She noticed the attention and seemed to mistake it for validation, continuing to outline fines and compliance reviews as if the checkpoint had turned into her personal meeting room. Another agent approached from the side and stood near her rear quarter, effectively cutting off her path back into the lane. She shifted her stance, suddenly aware of the uniforms surrounding her, but still talking. She said she needed names and license plates before anyone crossed. That was the line she crossed without realizing it. The agent nearest her told her plainly that she was not authorized to collect information in the controlled area and needed to step aside. His tone wasn't angry, just final. She scoffed and said the HOA would follow up regardless, waving her clipboard like it carried weight here. The agent responded by signaling for all vehicles to remain stopped and instructing another officer to secure the lane. That command snapped the situation into a new phase. What had been a disagreement was now a managed incident. The booth agent stepped away entirely, leaving the checkpoint idle while attention centered on her. She finally stopped talking, if only for a second, looking around as the reality crept in that nothing was moving until she did. Her face tightened and she took a step back, then another, still muttering about overreach. The agents didn't relax. One of them asked her to identify herself and return to her vehicle. She hesitated again, weighing whether to comply or push harder. From my seat, it was clear this wasn't over. Whatever happened next was going to involve more than words, and she still didn't seem to grasp that the boundary she challenged wasn't negotiable. The backup hit almost immediately once the agents stopped waving cars through. What had been a slow but steady line turned into a dead standstill, brake lights glowing all the way back toward the curve in the road. I could see drivers craning their necks, some stepping out of their vehicles farther back before being told to get back inside. The checkpoint had shifted from routine processing to containment mode, and that alone told me this was no longer about convenience. The agents weren't annoyed, they were focused, scanning positions, spacing themselves out with intent. One of the agents near the booth brought his radio up and spoke quietly, eyes locked on the woman with the clipboard. I couldn't hear what he said, but the response crackled back almost instantly. Another agent moved to the edge of the lane and redirected foot traffic away from the area, subtly widening the buffer zone around her. That change in posture was unmistakable. They weren't managing vehicles anymore, they were managing a person. She, meanwhile, kept her stance planted, continuing to explain HOA procedures like the environment hadn't changed at all. She raised her clipboard again and gestured toward the backed-up cars, telling anyone who would listen that delays were the result of residents ignoring association rules. A couple of people looked away, clearly uncomfortable being associated with her explanation. One driver shook his head and rolled his window up. The agents didn't respond to her commentary, which somehow made it louder. Silence from authority can feel heavier than an argument, and she didn't seem to understand that yet. Another agent arrived from farther down the checkpoint, briefed quickly by the first. He took up a position slightly behind her, blocking the open space she'd been using to pace. That repositioning boxed her in without touching her, and I saw her shoulders stiffen as she realized she wasn't free to move the way she had been. She glanced back at him, then forward again, still talking, but her rhythm was off now. The confidence that carried her earlier words started to thin. Traffic kept building behind us, stretching beyond the visible line. I heard a horn honk once, then stop like the driver thought better of it. The agents didn't rush, didn't escalate verbally, just maintained the pause. One of them wrote something down on a small notepad, eyes flicking between the woman and the line of cars. Documentation was happening in real time, and she was still treating the situation like a debate she could win by outlasting everyone else. She tried to reframe things, saying she was cooperating and only needed a moment to finish her notes. The nearest agent told her that the lane was closed until she complied with instructions. That was the first time consequences were stated plainly. The checkpoint wasn't delayed because of traffic. It was delayed because of her refusal to step away. That distinction mattered, and it landed harder than any raised voice would have. The agent with the radio spoke again, this time stepping a few feet away to relay more details. When he came back, his demeanor hadn't changed, but the space around her tightened another notch. Two agents now stood within arm's length, not crowding, just present. She noticed the shift and lowered her clipboard slightly, looking around as if trying to find support from the drivers. Nobody met her eye. At that point, the audience she'd been performing for was gone. She muttered something about overreach and private property, still not grasping that the entire checkpoint had moved into a different operational phase. The agents weren't reacting emotionally, they were executing procedure. Every second she stayed there added another layer to whatever report was being built. From my seat, it was obvious that this wasn't going to end with a warning and a shrug. The lane was frozen, authority was consolidated, and she was the sole variable left unresolved. Whatever came next would be formal, documented, and far beyond the reach of her clipboard. She cranked her voice up a notch, loud enough that it carried past the idling engines and into the rows behind us. She announced that HOA penalties would be issued to any resident who left without proper clearance, like she was reading from a rulebook everyone should already know. A few heads turned, then more, curiosity pulling attention her way even as people stayed inside their cars. The agents didn't react to the volume change, which only made her push harder, convinced that being heard meant being right. She claimed the association had an agreement that outranked local rules, saying it slowly as if careful wording would make it true. She pointed at the cones and booths, insisting the checkpoint existed on roads the HOA maintained. The agent nearest her corrected that immediately, telling her federal jurisdiction controlled the entire area during operations. She talked right over him, repeating that residents had signed governing documents. That choice shifted the moment from disagreement to defiance, and the agent's posture reflected it without drama. Two agents began walking toward her vehicle, not fast, not threatening, just purposeful. Another stood back to keep eyes on the line. A driver behind me lifted his phone and started recording through the windshield. Someone else did the same from the opposite lane. The presence of cameras didn't faze the agents at all, but it seemed to energize her. She squared her shoulders and kept going, telling everyone she'd forward footage to the board and pursue fines after the fact. The agent closest to her asked for her name and instructed her to step back toward her car. She answered the first part loudly and ignored the second, continuing to explain how enforcement worked. He repeated the instruction once, calmly, then stopped talking. That silence was louder than anything she'd said. Another agent reached her car and stood by the open door, making it clear that her options were narrowing. She pivoted and accused the agents of obstructing HOA business, waving the clipboard again. The supervising agent arrived at that point, identifiable by his demeanor more than anything else. He listened for about 10 seconds, then told her she was interfering with a federal checkpoint and needed to comply immediately. No threats, no lectures. She laughed once, nervously, and said she was just doing her job. The supervisor nodded like he'd heard that line before. The recording phones multiplied. People weren't whispering now, you could feel the shared understanding that something consequential was unfolding. The supervisor instructed an agent to initiate secondary screening protocols. That single phrase changed the stakes. The lane wasn't just paused, it was officially disrupted. She noticed the shift and tried to soften her tone, saying she only wanted documentation. The supervisor didn't engage with the explanation. He asked her to step into the inspection area so traffic could resume. She hesitated, looking from the agents to the drivers, then back again. Her voice dropped for the first time as she asked if that was really necessary. The supervisor said yes and gestured toward the marked area. An agent opened the path without touching her, just indicating where to go. She gathered her clipboard and walked, still talking but quieter now, the confidence leaking out with each step. As she moved, the agents restarted processing cars in the opposite lane, easing pressure while keeping her contained. That operational adjustment said everything. Control had fully transferred, and she was no longer the center of attention by choice. I pulled forward a few feet, watching as she was guided toward a spot away from the booths. The phones kept recording, the agents stayed professional, and the checkpoint breathed again. The line began inching forward, but nobody relaxed. The supervisor stayed with her near the inspection area, another agent already speaking into a radio. Whatever came next was clearly going to be formal and documented. As I rolled closer to the booth, it was obvious this wasn't ending with a warning. The situation had crossed into enforcement territory, and she still didn't seem to realize how far past the point of no return she'd gone. The supervising agent showed up without fanfare, just stepped into the space beside the woman's car like he'd been there the whole time. He asked her to return to her vehicle and remain seated while they resolved the disruption. His voice was even, almost bored, the tone of someone who'd already decided how this was going to end. She shook her head and said she couldn't, that she still had enforcement duties to complete before anyone left the community. That answer drew a brief pause from him, the kind that signals escalation without announcing it. He told her again to get inside the car, explaining that instructions were not optional in a controlled federal area. She replied that the HOA had contractual obligations that required immediate documentation. The supervisor listened for a moment, then glanced toward the booth where agents had resumed partial processing. That look wasn't for permission, it was coordination. An agent near the cones adjusted their position, narrowing the lane that led toward her. The physical environment was changing around her, even if she kept talking. She took a step toward the rear of her car instead of opening the door, continuing to outline how fines would be assessed. The supervisor raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence, and said she was refusing a lawful order. The words were calm, precise, and carried weight. A nearby agent keyed his radio and quietly confirmed the refusal. That was the moment the conversation stopped being informal. Procedure had taken over. The supervisor gave a small nod and signaled toward the inspection area. An agent moved a portable barrier into place, clearly marking the space she was now confined to. Another agent walked to the passenger side of her vehicle and checked inside, making sure no one else was present. She protested, saying this was unnecessary, but no one engaged with the argument. They were working through steps, not debating authority. Traffic began flowing again in the primary lane, slow but steady, while her situation remained frozen. That contrast was sharp. Everyone else was moving forward and she was standing still, surrounded by uniforms. The supervisor informed her she was being directed to secondary screening due to interference with checkpoint operations. He didn't threaten charges or speculate on outcomes. He just stated the reason and the process. She crossed her arms and said she wasn't going anywhere until the board was contacted. The supervisor acknowledged the statement and responded that refusal would be noted. Another agent recorded her information, asking for identification. She hesitated, then produced it with visible irritation. Phones were still up in nearby cars, but the agents ignored them completely, focused on documentation and control. An agent guided her a few steps closer to the inspection area, maintaining distance and keeping hands visible. She finally realized she wasn't in charge anymore and demanded to know what would happen next. The supervisor told her that determination would be made after screening and review. No promises, no explanations beyond that. The uncertainty landed harder than any threat. As I pulled forward toward the booth, I watched her standing there, clipboard forgotten at her side, eyes darting between agents. The checkpoint was back to normal speed for everyone else. Her situation, though, was clearly just beginning, and whatever came next was going to be handled far above the level she'd been used to dealing with. An agent near the booth spoke into his radio again, this time using codes I didn't recognize, and another vehicle was diverted into the secondary lane behind her. The supervisor stayed put, watching for compliance while she stood silent for once. The line moved, but the atmosphere didn't ease. Whatever review they were initiating wasn't going to finish today, and judging by the paperwork already started, she was about to learn how permanent federal notes can be. She was finally directed to pull into the inspection area, not rushed, not grabbed, just guided with a pointed hand and a clear path. The cones were shifted to open a lane, and an agent stood at the front to make sure she followed it. She hesitated, then started her engine and rolled forward slowly, like she expected someone to stop her and apologize. Nobody did. The rest of traffic moved again, the contrast sharp enough that even she had to notice it. What had been her stage was now just another controlled zone she didn't own. Once she parked, two agents approached from opposite sides, keeping a professional distance. One asked for her identification while the other stayed quiet, watching her hands and posture. She handed over her ID with a stiff smile, still trying to explain that there'd been a misunderstanding. The agent took the card, checked it against a handheld device, and asked her to step out of the vehicle. She complied this time, though her movements were tight and annoyed. The clipboard stayed behind on the seat, forgotten. They asked her simple questions about why she'd stepped into the lane and attempted to stop vehicles. She answered confidently at first, saying she was enforcing HOA compliance and maintaining order. The agent writing notes didn't react, just asked clarifying follow-ups about authority and agreements. When she mentioned contracts, he asked her to specify which federal agency authorized them. That pause stretched longer than she expected. Her answer drifted, less precise than before. Another agent joined them and explained that presenting herself as an authority figure in a federal checkpoint could qualify as misrepresentation. The word hung there, neutral but heavy. She pushed back, saying she never claimed to be federal. The agent nodded and said the concern was interference, not impersonation. That correction shifted the ground again. This wasn't about titles, it was about actions and consequences. While they spoke with her, a different agent stepped a few feet away and made a call. I couldn't hear the details, but I caught HOA management and verification in the conversation. That was the moment I realized this wasn't staying at the checkpoint. The issue was spreading outward into systems she probably assumed were on her side. She kept talking, unaware that her organization was now being looped in without her input. She tried to reassert control by explaining board structure and enforcement roles. The agent acknowledged the information and asked for contact details for the HOA's management company. She provided them, still convinced this would straighten everything out. When the agent told her they'd be contacted regarding misrepresentation and operational interference, her confidence dipped again. She asked if she was being detained. The response was calm and non-committal, stating she was being investigated for disruption. Traffic flowed smoothly now, the checkpoint back to full operation. Drivers passed through with barely a glance toward the inspection area. That isolation seemed to bother her more than the questioning. She was no longer performing, she was just another subject in a process. An agent returned from the call and quietly updated the supervisor, who nodded once and thanked him. The supervisor then informed her that HOA management had been reached and that her actions were being documented as independent, not authorized. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. That was the first real crack. The system she leaned on wasn't backing her play. She asked what would happen next. The supervisor said that determination would come after review and that she was to remain available. As I cleared the checkpoint and pulled away, I glanced back one last time. She stood near her car, agents around her, the clipboard still visible through the window like a relic from a different world. Whatever she thought this was when she stepped into the lane, it had turned into something far bigger. And judging by the calls being made, this wasn't the end of it, just the point where consequences started stacking up. I was already rolling past the inspection area when one of the agents waved me forward again, asking me to pause just beyond the cones. From that angle I could still see her clearly, standing beside her car with two agents positioned nearby. One of them was explaining something in a measured, almost instructional tone, hands relaxed at his sides. Even without hearing every word, I recognized the cadence from other briefings I'd witnessed before. This wasn't a warning anymore, it was a legal explanation. The agent told her she was being documented for obstruction of a federal operation. He didn't dramatize it or raise his voice, just laid out what the statute covered and why her actions fit the definition. He emphasized that intent didn't matter as much as impact, especially when checkpoint flow and officer safety were involved. She blinked a few times, clearly not used to hearing rules explained without room for argument. The confidence she'd carried earlier didn't disappear, but it shifted into something tighter and more cautious. She tried to pivot immediately, saying she was only trying to help maintain order and prevent chaos. The agent nodded, acknowledging the statement without validating it. He clarified that only checkpoint personnel were authorized to direct traffic or collect information in that space. Another agent typed steadily on a handheld device, not looking up, which seemed to bother her more than the words themselves. The realization that this was being logged in real time started to sink in. She asked whether this would go on her record, her voice noticeably lower than before. The agent replied that all incidents were recorded and reviewed, especially those involving interference. He explained the process step by step, how reports were forwarded and how determinations were made later by supervisors. No threats, no guesses, just facts. That procedural calm took the wind out of her attempts to reframe the situation. She glanced toward the line of cars moving smoothly through the booths, then back at the agent, as if finally noticing how isolated she'd become. Her clipboard was still visible on the seat, but she didn't reach for it. She asked if she could leave once the explanation was done. The response was neutral, stating that she needed to remain available until screening was complete. That answer landed hard. Waiting without control was clearly not her comfort zone. The agent went on to explain that misrepresenting authority during a federal operation could carry additional consequences, depending on review. He was careful not to speculate, but the implication was there. She nodded more than she spoke now, offering short acknowledgments instead of speeches. The agent documenting the exchange paused briefly to confirm details, then continued typing. The sound of those keys felt louder than the radios had earlier. She tried one more time to explain the HOA's role, framing it as a misunderstanding rather than defiance. The agent acknowledged the explanation and said it would be included in the report. That phrasing mattered. Included meant weighed, not accepted. Her shoulders dropped slightly and she exhaled, the first real sign that she understood she wasn't steering this anymore. Another agent approached and quietly confirmed that HOA management had acknowledged the call and requested documentation. When that was relayed to her, her expression shifted again, this time toward concern. She asked what they'd been told. The answer was simple, the facts. No spin, no advocacy, just what happened. That seemed to bother her more than any accusation could have. As I was finally waved forward to leave the checkpoint, I watched her stand there, listening instead of talking. The power dynamic had flipped completely. She wasn't arguing rules anymore, she was absorbing consequences. The agents remained professional and calm, but the situation was clearly far from resolved. Whatever review came next would happen off-site, on paper, and without her input. As I pulled away, it was obvious this moment was just the hinge. Everything after it was going to swing in a direction she hadn't anticipated. They told her to stay parked in the inspection area while the rest of the convoy moved on, and for the first time all morning she didn't argue. An agent relayed the instruction clearly, pointing toward the cones and then back toward the flow of traffic restarting behind her. Engines turned over, one by one, and the line began to stretch forward again. That movement alone was a power shift she couldn't ignore. Everything was proceeding without her involvement, and no one looked back for permission. She stood beside her car as agents repositioned, reopening lanes and restoring the checkpoint's rhythm. The supervising agent remained with her, explaining that she was being issued a formal warning for interference with federal operations. He said it evenly, like he was reading a checklist, not scolding. Another agent noted the warning in their system, confirming time, location, and behavior. She listened quietly, nodding along, her clipboard still untouched inside the vehicle. The agent told her the incident would be documented and reviewed, then asked her to acknowledge the warning verbally. She did, voice steady but subdued, no trace of the earlier bravado. That acknowledgement sealed the moment. This wasn't a debate or a misunderstanding anymore. It was an official action with a record attached. The agent explained that future interference could carry escalated consequences. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. As the last of our convoy cleared the booths, the checkpoint returned to full operation. Agents resumed scanning IDs, waving vehicles through with the same calm efficiency as before. From where I idled briefly, waiting for my turn to merge back onto the highway, I could see her now standing alone, slightly off to the side, while the system moved on. The contrast was sharp and final. She asked if she was free to leave. The supervisor told her she could depart once traffic cleared and it was safe to do so, but not before. That small delay carried weight. Even her exit was controlled now, folded into procedure rather than preference. She nodded again, eyes down, absorbing the reality that the situation had ended without her input. An agent walked her through what would happen next, explaining that the report would be forwarded and that her HOA had already been contacted. He emphasized that any follow-up would occur outside the checkpoint, through proper channels. She didn't respond right away, just stared toward the booths where cars kept passing without incident. The scene no longer revolved around her, and that seemed to land heavier than the warning itself. When I was finally waved forward to leave, the checkpoint felt normal again, like the disruption had been a brief glitch already smoothed out. Behind me she remained parked, waiting for clearance to go, a small figure next to a car that no longer mattered to the operation. As I merged onto the road, it was clear the authority had spoken, documented, and moved on. Whatever consequences followed would come later, out of sight, and entirely on their terms. A few days after the checkpoint incident, the fallout finally caught up with the neighborhood, and that's when it became clear this hadn't stayed contained to that stretch of road. An email went out from the HOA to all residents, flagged as important, written in that stiff, overly careful tone that usually means legal eyes have already been on it. The message said the association wanted to clarify that no board member was authorized to act on behalf of the HOA at federal facilities or checkpoints. It stressed that any actions taken during the incident were done independently and without approval. The wording was precise, almost surgical, like they were carving distance with every sentence. People started talking almost immediately. Group chats lit up, neighbors comparing notes about what they'd seen or heard. Someone forwarded a screenshot of the email with a single comment underneath. Translation, not our problem. What stood out wasn't just what the notice said, but what it avoided. Her name wasn't mentioned once. No apology, no explanation, just a clean break. That silence spoke louder than any public statement could have. Later that week, another update followed, this one shorter. It announced changes to board responsibilities and listed revised points of contact for compliance matters. Her name was gone. The role she'd been so loud about enforcing didn't exist for her anymore. There was no drama attached, no justification offered. It read like a routine administrative update, which somehow made it more final. The system had corrected itself quietly, without ceremony. I ran into her once after that, days later, in the neighborhood parking area. She avoided eye contact, moved quickly, and didn't have the clipboard anymore. The badge was gone too. There was nothing outwardly dramatic about the moment, but the shift was obvious. She wasn't scanning cars or taking notes. She was just another resident, heading inside without stopping anyone else. Whatever confidence had fueled her at the checkpoint hadn't survived the aftermath. The HOA never followed up publicly beyond those emails. There were no meetings, no debates, no vote announcements. It was as if the organization decided the best move was to absorb the damage and keep moving. From what I heard through neighbors, the management company had stepped in hard, reminding the board about jurisdiction boundaries and liability exposure. That kind of conversation doesn't need an audience to be effective. What stuck with me most was how quickly authority snapped back into its proper shape once the real system engaged. At the checkpoint, there was no shouting, no theatrics, just calm procedure applied step by step until control was restored. Afterward, the same thing happened at the HOA level. documentation, distance, reassignment. No personal attacks, just consequences unfolding exactly where they were supposed to. Looking back, the contrast between her certainty and the reality of the situation was almost stark. She'd believed authority traveled with her, that a title meant power anywhere she stood. The border checkpoint didn't entertain that idea for even a minute. Neither did the HOA once federal attention was involved. Both systems did the same thing, defined boundaries, enforced them, and moved on. The whole thing left behind a kind of quiet lesson that didn't need spelling out. Clipboards, badges, and bylaws only matter inside the lanes they're designed for. The moment you step outside that space, especially into federal ground, those tools turn into props. Watching that play out in real time made one thing painfully clear. HOA authority stops at the borderline, period, and pretending otherwise comes with a price that paperwork can't talk its way out of.
Alright, now I want to hear from you. Do you think she was completely out of the line here? Or do you believe authority sometimes goes too far? Drop your take in comments, I read every single one.